need support staff to clear the room. Stand up and walk now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ryan. I am an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me on the other line, as always, it's Andy Greenwald.
We're feisty today.
Oh, you bet. Today is Monday in America, maybe the last one. We've got a stock show for you today. We've got Mandalorian episode 1 reaction, Undoing episode 2 reaction. We're also going to talk about some movie industry news. We'll get right into it with today's episode of The Watch coming up next.
This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day, or hiking, or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago, and the guy was like, you're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago. I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
Oh, Mando, you've returned, sir! And Nate Silva just told me to take 2 snorts of Spotch guns. Stop looking at the Iowa polls! Mando!
The thing that makes you the best, the very best, Chris Karga, is that you managed to consolidate all of my interests. The only thing missing in that performance was any reference to Dave Wasserman on Twitter. Like, if you could just give me a little bit of like county polling mixed in there, you know, whether the former Mos Eisley, like if the polls of Mos Eisley are weighting for like demographic, for race, which in this case is, are you blue
Shy
or
Boba
are you
Fett
not blue?
Voters. Yeah.
There's a lot at play today, and
What's
thank
up,
God
man?
we have things to focus on.
Here we are. Monday, obviously a huge election tomorrow. We have that on the brain, and it's hard to concentrate on anything else, but we're doing our best here because we've got a lot on our plate. So today, as I mentioned, Andy and I are going to talk about the first episode of Mandalorian, the second episode of The Undoing. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time just catching up with you because obviously I haven't seen you, haven't talked to you in a while.
That's nice.
How are you doing? How was your weekend?
Great. I mean, you know, you always ask me that, and I always deliver. You know, every weekend is great. You can always tell the difference between the days.
Did you get stuck in any caravans this weekend?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I made a mistake on my MAGA Facebook group. I signed up to throttle the Throgs Neck Bridge, but I forgot that I live in California now.
Yeah.
So sorry, they were one freedom soldier down. Hopefully they were able to make do. No, you know, it was Halloween weekend under different circumstances here in America. I'm not really a big dresser upper, you know, like, is that, you?
I haven't in honestly, like maybe more than 35 years.
I think we've talked about this in the podcast in past years, but I am firmly of the opinion that Halloween is the holiday for children. And I love that. And I celebrate that. And I don't personally feel the need to participate. I will say that my older daughter got some like hair chalk that colors your hair I cannot stress this enough, in a temporary fashion, and applied a really pleasing shade of neon green, which I really liked. So I felt like I was. Did
it remind you of like Eagles uniforms? Why did you like it?
Well, she liked it because it was reminiscent of the male lead in the Disney original film Zombies. I liked it, yes, because the Kelly Green brought me back to my boyhood days in South Philadelphia with, you know, the rest of the boo birds.
I have a theory I want to bounce. This is going to be a podcast of theories. Great time for theories right now.
Wild speculation is what I'm here for. Like, I personally have a needle inside of myself, not the one that I was using to jab tranquilizers into my arm, but the one that is giving me outcome predictions. And I will respond to your theories in the form of the needle.
I don't think there's any reason for an adult to celebrate Halloween post-college unless they are single or have kids.
Right.
So like you either use it as a platform to meet a possible significant other, even if it's just for one night, I'm not judging, or you're doing it to celebrate with your kids. But if you are in a committed relationship as an adult, it just feels weird. It's like, why would you participate in it? I like the candy part, and I'll play some Halloween jams, and if kids in non-contact averse times want to knock on the door, I usually have a bowl of Nestle Crunches and Kit Kats to dole out. But yeah, I'm not really sure where it's just like, I watch a ton of horror movies, but that's not really that different from the other time of year.
I want to jump in and just say, I hear you, but I also think that if you are putting on a costume solely for the hookups or the potential love match, I feel like that's false advertising and it's going to come back and bite you. Because if you present yourself to someone as a person who's just like, this is fun, Borat costume, like they're going to think that's who you are. You know what I mean? They're going to think well of you, and they're going to be like, we connected over this. And so the next year rolls around, you're happily cohabitating, things are vibing. Maybe you're getting one of those friends and family Spotify accounts that I'd love to talk to you about off air, because that would be great for me in my household. And then all of a sudden, your significant other comes downstairs with some things she's pulled from the local market, and she's like, we're doing Paris and Nicole and the Simple Life circa 2003 this year. And you're like, that's not me. You know what I mean? But then you got to do it.
Are you speaking from experience here?
No, I'm thinking that I've done a kindness here, because my children have been disabused of the notion that their dad is fun. You know what I mean? And I think that's probably good.
Right. I wanted to, before we get to Mandalorian, do you think that, just before we jump into that, do you think anyone was like so ahead of the game that on Friday they watched Mandalorian and then the next night they went as the character reveal from the end of the first episode and was just like wandering around the neighborhood in a cloak with no hair, and people were like, what's up with this guy? And he was like, I am the yet to be determined reveal at the end of Mandalorian.
I'm going to answer that in two parts. One, yes, 100%. Someone
tried it. Yeah.
But second part is wandering around a mostly empty and quiet neighborhood wearing a cloak of some kind is Halloween 2020.
Right.
Because you keep suggesting that people went somewhere
or
gathered in some fashion. And that was not the case. That was not the case this year.
So the one bit of news that I wanted to do with you before we got into Mandalorian and Undoing was the announcement that came out today that a planned film adaptation of one of my favorite books. So I think we've mentioned this before, but like this is one of those things where you read a news story like a couple of times to like be like, is it daylight savings dreaming? Like what's going on yet? So Tom Hardy is producing an adaptation of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. For people who don't know what that is, it's a book that was published in 1990, I believe. I think it won the National Book Award. Can't recall off the top of my head.
More importantly, it won preteen Chris Ryan's heart.
It did. I don't think I read it upon its publication, but it was like end of high school, beginning of college when I was starting to get really interested in short stories, the form. Can you believe how much fucking time in our lives we spent on short stories?
Of all the things that I studied, I think
it's right up there with...
there was
probably somebody so much better at short stories than us who was like, I beat you at short stories, and now look at them.
You mean now that they're a Pulitzer Prize winner for best short story? I just think that like at the time we would have been like, haha, we'll never use you, math.
Right.
But short stories will be relevant to our interests.
Yes.
Well,
so it's a series of interlocking short stories about a squad of guys serving in the Vietnam War. It's sort of, it jumps around from before, during, and after. And it's written by Tim O'Brien, who served in Vietnam and wrote another novel about the Vietnam War. Most of his novels are somehow about the Vietnam War. But the other one that was sort of very famous was Going After Cacciato, which is a novel about a squad of Vietnam soldiers following after a deserter who claims that he is walking to Paris. So that's Cacciato. The things they carried is really just a series of interlocking stories, but mostly told from the perspective of the very thinly veiled Tim O'Brien narrator. And
Jim O'Brien.
It's just largely, a lot of it is about storytelling. A lot of these stories, and this is what's sort of interesting about it. It's largely about storytelling, about the nature of what's a true story, about how much your memory can be dependable, how much when you hear someone tell you a story, it changes from telling to telling and from person to person. And I'm fascinated to see how they're going to pull this off. It has probably it won the Olympics for like cast announcement. It's Tom Hardy, Ty Sheridan, who I assume is playing the lead role, Stephen James, Bill Skarsgård, Ashton Sanders, and Pete Davidson. And the Pete Davidson thing is obviously the big curveball. Scott Smith, who wrote the novel and the adaptation of the novel for The Ruins. The Ruins is a really awesome beach read from a few years back, and then wrote the screenplay and the novel for A Simple Plan. And I think has been working on an Amazon series I'm not sure what's happening with. He wrote the screenplay for this. It's obviously a huge task. I think most people raise their eyebrows at the announcement of the director, which is Rupert Sanders.
Yeah. I mean, all I can do is continue to raise my eyebrow in this audio format.
Right. The director of Snow White and the Huntsman and Ghost in the Shell. Two really tough flicks, and is probably most notable for a very, very public affair and divorce when he was photographed with Kristen Stewart and got divorced from his wife. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know when the last time a novel or a piece of literature that I loved this much was announced. I mean, we might be going back to No Country for Old Men, honestly, where I was like, I have such a personal investment in the material. I know you haven't read it. I don't know if this is encouraging you to do so.
Well, I think being reminded of this work and how much it meant to you, and also as I was joking with you over text this morning, just remembering like how politicized one's personal entertainment choices were in the 90s. We often talk about that in terms of music, but I remember actively not reading this book because it didn't, because I was reading like English novels or something. There was like I didn't want to read an American book about war because I was too, I mean, it's a wonder we're friends, honestly. I'm grateful for your patience with me during these long years, but it's something I definitely should check out. The thing that I would say just purely as from our vantage point as people who love to make observations about Hollywood from a very, very large height and distance from the material, especially in this case, the red flag for me here is it's not just the director. It's that generally a beloved piece of work like this that is, as you just described it, which is subjective from multiple perspectives, it demands a very, I would say, certain aesthetic point of view to tackle it. You can't tell a collection of short stories or, conflicting POV stories from conflicting POVs in a film. Maybe you could do that in a television adaptation with different filmmakers or creators brought on for each quote unquote chapter, right? But for this, you kind of need to have a take and you need to commit to the take. And that generally requires either an auteurist sensibility or kind of a very strong aesthetic point of view. And with no disrespect to Rupert, whom we don't know at all, and may have been, playing the studio game to get movies made and has long had a passion for either this work or this genre, or maybe just wants to make something more artistic and personal and finally is being given the possibility to do it. Those all may be true. But if they're not, it does seem that the primary aesthetic driver of putting this together is Tom Hardy, right? Which
Are you saying that that's a problem?
It's not a problem for this podcast. It's actually a boon for this podcast.
I mean, it's a huge moment for me. It's a huge moment for me.
And I'm really happy for you, and I hope it's not the only huge moment for you this week. But I think that my personal red flag is I think for something like this, you would need a firm hand on the rudder being like, this is what this story is, not like, hey, let's get a bunch of our actor buddies together to just wild out in the jungle because that's where awards are won. You know what I mean? So
right.
It's all TBD. As you said, if the script is good, then the script is good. And maybe we'll be off to the races. But it's interesting. And it's telling that you used No Country for Old Men as an example of something that you adored. I mean, that was the Coen brothers. So we knew we would be getting something
And they cast
worthy.
it as soon as the casting was announced for that, you kind of couldn't see those characters as anybody else but Bardem, Brolin, and Tommy Lee Jones. I would say that somebody in my Twitter mentions when I tweeted about the Deadline story announcing this project was like, this just seems like a perfect Band of Brothers style miniseries. I mean, if you wanted to do 10 or 15 episodes or whatever, however many of the short stories there are, but you could pretty much do this as a collection of short stories across in a miniseries. And I don't think I'm trying to remember, but I don't think that there has been that kind of fictional treatment for the Vietnam War yet, where they've done something like that on TV, or at least on sort of premium cable. So I'm sort of surprised that that's not the way this is being executed, and maybe
it could be a great film, but I don't want to argue against it before we even know what it's going to be. But I, in keeping with a conversation that's been ongoing on the pod, especially in relation to the Queen's Gambit, like I really just want more site-specific, time-specific, historical-specific indulgences that are based on fictional stories, not on not on the official record. You know what I mean? And so for that reason, I think making a Vietnam War series based on the writings of Tim O'Brien is so much more exciting to me than like on the writings of David Halberstam or something.
Sure.
Just because you could go to some creative places that you couldn't otherwise, and that's kind of interesting. But that's also where our heads are at, and who knows where we'll be at by the time this movie comes out.
Was there any other general stuff you wanted to get into before we did Mandalorian and Undoing?
What's your definitive Sean Connery performance? Like for you,
right.
What's your one? Because obviously the great Sean Connery, great film actor, left us this weekend at age 90. And for people of our generation, I think, and maybe you're about to contradict me, I didn't see his Bond movies for a while, like until I was older. So I saw him first in other movies and didn't have that. I mean, people of a certain age, they're like, well, he's James Bond. And then he had this interesting career. For me, he's probably first and foremost Dr. Henry Jones in the Indiana Jones series. And then later I saw the Bond movies, you know, so I don't know where you're at with it.
For Connery, you need to choose three. There's what Bond do you want? What non-Bond but prime era Connery do you want? And then what Golden Lion Connery do you want of like after of Untouchables and beyond? So that would be like The Rock and Indiana Jones and Hunt for October. But basically when he becomes this kind of like silver dawn of movie acting. Bond, I would probably go From Russia with Love. That's probably my favorite Bond up there with like You Only Live Twice and Skyfall. And then non-Bond, I saw a lot of people shouting out The Man Who Would Be King, which is an amazing movie. I thought I would just mention The Hill, which is a 1965 Sidney Lumet movie that is an incredible. It's not really a war movie; it's more of a training movie. But Sean Connery's performance in that is amazing, and it kind of has like Stalag 17 vibes in terms of like acts of small resistance within these sort of oppressive worlds like the military. And then my sort of Silver Lion one would be, I think I'd go Hunt for October.
I mean, it's pretty great.
Yeah. Hunt for October. I mean, his performance is just being like, I'm going to just do a Scottish accent. Just deal with it is amazing anyway. But that is, he's Titanic in that movie, man. He's so good.
I think your list is really good. For Bond, I haven't watched the early ones in a long time. They all kind of blur together for me. I guess I remember Goldfinger the most, but can you really say that like his performance in one is better than the others? Because he's just kind of
not really.
It,
and
right?
he actually, I think there's a couple of cool moments in those movies. I mean, his Bond is the meanest, I think.
That's the thing I was going to say. The thing that is really striking about that, and that is almost unfathomable today, is that he seems like he doesn't seem like he hates the performance, but his character is an asshole, right?
Yeah.
Like he's just kind of vicious and surly. And it's so at odds with what being a movie star, particularly for what now we think of as franchises, means, right? Because you have to, the template now is Downey and Iron Man, right? Where you are always winking. You are always in on the joke of the whole thing. Exactly.
Downey is essentially doing Roger Moore in a lot of ways.
I think then he sort of went into the wilderness, right? And then, because I remember when The Untouchables came out and he won the Oscar for it, everyone was like, "Oh, Connery's back," which is crazy to think he was ever gone. Right before The Untouchables came out, though, The Name of the Rose came out, which is a pretty cool movie that I remember quite well. But for me, I mean, I think I said at the beginning, I know this is now a medium warm if it has any temperature at all take, but I think Last Crusade is my favorite Indiana Jones movie, and it's entirely because of him. And
wait
that dynamic.
Is that like a thing that you've said before?
What? That's my favorite.
That Last Crusade you think is better than Raiders?
I've never publicly said it, no.
And now, but you're on the record now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not a shy Last Crusade voter. You know what I mean? Like, you can poll me and I'll tell you the truth. I like it better.
Okay.
What about, do you remember Rising Sun?
Yeah.
Which is that like super racist Michael Crichton adaptation where Connery is like the wise detective who understands Japan, and Wesley Snipes
he's like really immersed himself in the Japanese culture.
I just want to end this.
Whenever you can get Connery immersing himself in another culture,
so good.
It's a green light picture.
I got three quick hits before we move on, and then because we got to talk about Mandalorian, it's what we're here to do. But one of my favorite things that emerged this weekend were just Connery anecdotes, and obviously he had a complicated personal life that I don't know enough about to really comment on. But just in
Trump
terms of
had
how
a really
he was,
good Connery anecdote.
Oh, thanks. Good. Well, I can't wait to check that out. Luckily, I subscribe to Dan Bongino on Facebook or whatever, so I'll get the updates directly to my feed. That he was while filming The Rock, which is a phenomenal film. Mm-hmm. Michael Bay attempted to give him some direction. This was ascribed to an unnamed actor who was on the set, and I read this on Twitter, so take it as you will. But
print the legend.
And so Michael Bay attempted between takes to give Sean Connery some acting advice, and Connery blinked quietly, turned and faced Michael Bay and said, "Why don't you go blow up a bridge?" And then finally, I think people know this, right? That like his last movie was the really disastrous adaptation of what is actually really smart and cool Alan Moore comic book, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Right.
Right. And did you see this? Like why he took that part?
The money?
Well, yes, but also because in the preceding years, he had been offered the role of Morpheus in The Matrix multiple times, turned it down saying, "I don't understand this." Then they offered him Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. And he said, "I don't understand this," which is odd because it had been in existence for decades.
Yeah, it's like Gandalf is like a character I feel like people have a pretty good handle on.
But he's like, "I don't understand this." And so then when Don Murphy called and said, "Do you want to do this League of Extraordinary Gentlemen?" he said, "I want to be clear about something here. I don't understand this, but I said no to the last two things." So he did it, thinking it was going to be a big hit. And then when it was a disaster, he did one of my favorite moves that only true legends can do, which is he just literally, well, he didn't literally say it, but he figuratively, career-wise, just said, "Fuck this shit."
It just didn't work.
Never did it again.
Yeah.
I also want to draw people's attention to Alan Cumming, star of Briar Patch and other things, who posted something really touching and surprising on Instagram about Sean Connery, which I just was really stunned by because you think of him, again, this sort of complicated personal reputation, but that they bonded over difficult childhoods in Scotland. And Connery was a really kind and like father-like figure to him, which is really sweet and not something I expected at all.
Do you think Connery was up for Begbie in Trainspotting and he was just like, "I don't understand this"?
No, I think he was like, "I understand this too well." So I must choose to be in First Night instead, or Dragonheart.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll do Mando and Undoing. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. New Year's resolutions are fun the first couple of weeks. Then you kind of maybe conveniently forget about them halfway through January. No shame. It happens to us all. But this year I have a foolproof plan, at least when it comes to saving money. Just switch to Mint Mobile and you're done. Goal accomplished, because for a limited time, their wireless plans are $15 a month when you buy a 3-month plan. The great thing about Mint Mobile is there's no jaw-dropping monthly bills or unexpected overages, and all plans come with unlimited talk and text. Get this new customer offer today at mintmobile.com/watch. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. All right, man, we're back. And so is The Mandalorian, season 2. Although really just an extension. Chapter 9, it's called The Marshal, is the first episode of the second season. And probably I would say this is the most finely tuned machine on television right now. Like you can just tell that in the face of COVID, in the face of huge expectations, in the face of all these different pressures coming down on them from fan service perspective, from possibly being the kind of the jumping off point for whatever comes next in the whole Star Wars franchise, this show just kind of does its thing. It is still doing, at least in the early part of the season, just like it did last season. It will probably do like an adventure of the week and incrementally introduce new stuff. I've heard, there's been some discussion, and people should definitely check out Ben Lindbergh's exhaustive and basically everything you need to know about each episode of The Mandalorian. Ben will have on The Ringer. And I'd love to talk with him about it on the watch at some point this season. But I thought this was a good episode. You know what I mean? Like I basically had a very similar reaction to this one that I did to Mandalorian when it first came out, which was, this was really cool. I think if I was 13, I'd think it was the coolest thing in the world.
Yes.
And Oliphant was great. And the reveal was sick. And whatever that reveal really is, we can get into that. But, there was never a doubt that they were going to get the dragon, or that there was I don't really feel like there's a lot of, not stakes, but there's not a lot of dramatic tension in these early episodes of The Mandalorian. And I think that they are just really good at pacing this show. What did you think of the first one?
I think I agree with everything you said, and I feel remiss. I'm sorry that we never had a proper end of season conversation about the show last year, because I think I was in the middle of the last days of post-production or whatever. No, we kind of didn't. You may have had it with other people.
Did Taika direct the last one? I can't remember.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, that was, and he went fucking sicko mode in that. So we ended on a pretty high.
Yeah, well, the last two episodes I think were the best of last season. But I think the most important point that you made, I want to just double down on, which is that I am much more comfortable with this show now that I realize that it is made for 13-year-olds. That's totally fine. Well, I think that's great.
I'm saying, I think that is like who would enjoy this the most. I'm not necessarily saying that's who they're making it for. You are saying that.
Well, it sounds dismissive to say that it's for 13-year-olds. That's not what I mean. I think that there is a tradition that the original Star Wars movies would fall into, although they weren't necessarily designed that way at the time, where there was a style of adventure movie that was, for lack of a better word, family friendly, right? And then comic books were like this too. Like all of this stuff wasn't, I don't think, to take the sort of sting of snobbery out of this, that's just what these entertainments were, right? But as fans of comic books and Star Wars got older and kept holding on to their toys, shouts to all the action figures in Steve Carell's apartment in 40-Year-Old Virgin, the material tended to age up with them and then ended up in this very uncomfortable divide that we find ourselves in with a lot of this entertainment, where it's supposed to please a 45-year-old, but also entice a 15-year-old. And it's just trying to do too much. And you end up with these overstuffed nothing burgers like Rise of Skywalker. And I think that what Favreau has very smartly done, and maybe he's just came to it honestly by saying, this is my engagement with this stuff. And it's with my 13-year-old brain, because that's probably how old he was when the first Star Wars movie came out. I'm going to make something that is generally appealing to this large swath of people. And there were times last season where I think that what you and I came into the show with was a hope, although maybe I'd revisit it now, that this was that slightly more grown-up Star Wars that we've been promised for all those years. And look, Werner Herzog is in this or whatever, but that's not what it is. And once I made peace with that, I really started to let loose and enjoy it more. And so the thing that past that I wanted to say, before we talk about giant space worms, which really just felt like Favreau being like Denis Villeneuve, like, step
really,
to moi.
Checkmated Dune right there.
He was like, Dune just
don't even burn the negative, bro.
Don't even release this. Do you want to know what a pain box feels like? It's called Mandalorian Season 2, Episode 1. So the show, and I think I almost underrate it for this reason. The Mandalorian, I feel like, has 3 objectives in its storytelling. And longtime listeners of The Watch know that you and I, Chris, will get on things when they have more than one objective, right? Like, it gets really tricky to do more than one thing well, because it's really hard to do one thing well. So The Mandalorian is trying to do 3 things. Let me see if you're with me. First and foremost, it's basically a high IP A-team for a new generation, where an adventurer walks into a new situation, saves the day, and walks off. And that's the bulk of the episodes. 2, though, is that it is also a serialized adventure show with its own mythology and pantheon of characters. And that's the sort of model of the first season, where the first 2 episodes were essentially about, the mission to get the baby Yoda and what does it mean. And then at the end, here are the friends we made along the way with Gina Carano and Carl Weathers, and R.I.P. to Taika's droid. But this is the crew, and we're going to figure this out. And then all of a sudden, Giancarlo Esposito's there, and he's got a black lightsaber. What does this all mean? It's about his childhood. The Mandalorian was a baby once. And now we're back to the A-Team in this episode. The third thing that I have not engaged in at all until this morning, which I'm already regretting, is that it is a massive fan service trove that also kind of is operating as like a high-def pope, canonizing and elevating sacred texts from 40 years.
You are correct, sir. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I never engaged with that, which is a good thing that I was still entertained. But this morning, I accidentally Googled black lightsaber, and holy shit.
Yeah, man.
What are we doing?
I was like, I just want to confirm that was Boba Fett at the end of the episode. Right. I think that's what we are led to be believed. If you just go into The Mandalorian knowing about the stuff that happens in the original Star Wars trilogy, and then you watch The Mandalorian Chapter 9, you're like, oh, that must be Boba Fett. Right. I don't know that it is. But I can't actually, yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, here's why I say so. Because I think, I named those 3 things that the show's doing, but I should say, I think it's doing remarkably well. It's almost impossible to do all those things, and the show makes it look kind of easy by carrying itself with authority. The whole pace is extremely stately and slow, which I respect.
Why are you Mike Pensing my Boba Fett question? You're like, you just completely changed the subjects.
And because, listen, I just have a little red eye. It's nothing serious. There's a little redness. Because I think what makes the show successful is that you don't need to do those Wikipedia deep dives that you would have to do to understand that the character at the end who's looking longingly at Boba Fett's armor as it goes away is actually a 5th generation clone of Jango Fett or whatever. I think the reason the show works is because I don't need to know the Mandalorian history of the black Darksaber or whatever. I just need to know that the bad guy has a cool sword. So I think that the simplest explanation is often the best one, and I think that that's why I believe that to be the case. And, as another part of my mistaken deep diving this morning, so Timothy Oliphant's character, who I think we should speak about his involvement before we finish, is a expanded universe character. This is someone that existed, and then they cast him
in a novelization, right?
In the novelizations, and it took me rewatching parts of the end of last season to realize I enjoyed the show. I don't understand what Mandalorians are. I don't know who that lady is underneath the planet. I don't get it, but I'm okay with that, and so I respect the triangulation. I know it sounds like I'm a career politician here. You know what I mean? But I was an effective governor of Indiana.
Yes.
And I will do the same as the leader of the COVID task
Yes,
force.
mother. We love The Mandalorian. I agree with you. I do not think that you need to have... Whereas when you were watching Game of Thrones, I think that it helped immensely to engage with the extra textual stuff, which in and of itself was just the books and then all the scholarship around the books. And Concepcion made that so fun by doing Maester, and Binge does that, and where it's just like, you can just watch it and just be like, oh, the brother and the sister are humping. Or you can know about all the crazy stuff that the Lannisters have gotten up to over the course of hundreds of years, and the prophecies and the this and the that and the other.
That's a plot line in Call My Agent too, by the way. Just as a little
I bet it is. Dirty French. So yeah. So I was just gonna say,
but that what you're saying is exactly right, because Game of Thrones is the model for the modern franchise, because it requires second screen, third screen, 5th book, multiple blog posts, full 24/7 immersion, and it rewards that. And I think what's so smart, and I hopefully this has trickled upwards to the Lucasfilm office in general, is I think Favreau is saying people like this movie because the stormtroopers look cool and there were laser swords. You know what I mean? It's not that complicated. There's some space Muppets and people are doing the right thing. And it's reduced it back to that. So you can And that maybe that's one of the roles that Dave Filoni, who worked on all, the animated show that people love and seems to be considered
Clone
canon
Wars?
for a lot of this Clone Wars.
Yeah.
Maybe that's where he comes in. But Favreau seems there's something very Spartan about the show, and you could use that critically sometimes when you talk about maybe the dialogue or the pacing. But I think it helps when it comes to the fan
couple
service.
good bars in this episode. I think that was sort of my issue with last season. Was I kind of wished that they snazzed it up a little bit, or the characters were a little bit more linguistically distinctive, if that makes sense. Like I just wished some people had like attitude or a little bit more of a sense of humor. I think that they've loosened up the quote unquote, a guy who never takes his helmet off, but they've loosened up the Mandalorian character a little bit.
They have. It's an unprecedented show because just in general, I mean, we said this last year, but like the special effects, the puppetry, the sound design. I mean, this looks like a blockbuster film. It looks like nothing else on television, except every so often, moments after I think of like, oh my God, this is incredible. How do they pull this off? I'm like, they're in a warehouse in Manhattan Beach. Mm-hmm. There's something about the show every so often where I'm like, I'm not sure if that's a choice or if that's a warehouse in Manhattan Beach. And I respect the hell out of it.
The fact that they have been really at the very far reaches of figuring out how to make stuff during COVID, knowing that they, I think, are underway with season 3, right? Like at least.
I haven't heard, but probably.
And I know that I think they had begun shooting season 2 before lockdown happened and everything.
They were almost done.
Oh, they were. Okay. Because there's some times where I'm like, is Amy Sedaris really there?
I feel, well, I mean, it helps also that Favreau remembers some of the very basic things that are in the DNA of the franchise, which I don't know if Lucas ever like articulated it. He probably did. But one way to avoid getting in trouble basically one way to maintain this being a kids movie is you make all the bad guys dress in white armor so they don't have faces or personalities, so you can just mow them down with impunity. And similarly, like, shouts to my red shirt homies forever, the Sand People.
Yeah.
For just showing up to get eaten because they're not actually, you don't see their faces.
All of the Tuscan like sign language that they do is essentially like the way guys in 1978 used to give the finger on the New Jersey Turnpike, where they'd be like, "Hey, whoa, I'm driving here. It's the fast lane for a reason."
One of my favorite late night comedy
Get that
bits was
jalopy
when
out of here.
Nick Kroll, I think he was on Conan, and he did like I think we talked about it with him when he was on the podcast. But he does a character called 1970s guy eating in a movie. Where like he's like, no, you need to go down to the get down to the Whitestone Bridge. Hold on, you gonna eat those fries? And like basically
tough weekend for the Whitestone Bridge.
I keep shouting out the great Burrows and our MAGA warriors doing their best to lock it down out there. Respect. That's vibe is every time Mando sits around a campfire with the Tusken Raiders. There's a lot of sheep's head bay gesticulating.
Yeah,
which
take
I really
Fifth
respect.
Avenue South. Can we talk about Oliphant? Because he's obviously. Yeah. I think I've sung his praises a lot over the years. Me and him go back in the day, but I can imagine that there are some dark nights of the soul for Timothy Oliphant where he's just like it sucks being this fucking funny, this goddamn attractive, and people only think I can play members of the United States Marshal Service. I want to show my range. Mm-hmm. And then I think you wake up on Thursday and you're like, you know what? I'm pretty attractive. I'm pretty funny. I've done very well for myself. And really great directors keep putting me in projects to play a marshal.
And now I get to put on Boba Fett's armor. Yeah.
Life could be worse. He lives in Titletown. He's got his Dodgers championship. He's just he never has to change outfits. He can keep his hair the same way. Sometimes he puts the Seth Bullock mustache on. Sometimes he takes it off. But for the most part, show up in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, show up in Justified, show up on The Mandalorian. What could be worse? Fargo, yeah.
I'll say that his hair was too good for Tatooine.
His
hair's too good for Earth. But
fucking outrageous.
It really was.
It was outrageous.
There are times when he looks more CGI.
It kind of had like a post-Memphis Belle. Like it was like the guys from Memphis Belle who had been home for 6 months, maybe.
There are times when the desert light hits him just so, and I'm like, Baby Yoda looks more real than you do. You know what I mean? Like,
I agree.
Just full stop.
Yeah.
It is a thing, and I wish that I had either the memory anymore or frankly, the time, I guess, to research this. But I do feel like there was probably an era, or maybe this was TV until this century, where an actor or an actress could make a living playing the same part across multiple shows. And maybe not the splashiest living, but a living. And it feels like a throwback, not necessarily in the best way, that all cocky martial parts go to Oliphant, and that all ominous, slow-speaking, monologue-rocking villains go to Giancarlo Esposito. Now, both these guys, we love them, and I'm happy they're working. And particularly, I said this the other week, but like once I listened to Esposito on Maron, I'm like, this guy seems great.
Yeah.
What a delight. I'm happy he's finding this late career renaissance.
Can you do a quick power ranking of recent Maron? When was Esposito on?
Over the
For
summer.
Saul?
Wait, let me just to finish to say, I kind of would love to see someone else be the villain. That's all. And
you want a wider array of marshals.
And a wider array of marshals to take them down.
Well,
that's all.
Like so far, I guess Esposito is like earmarked as the villain. The thing about this show is that they do not show it doesn't show its hand. So for as much as like they have created this environment in which Esposito could be the villain, would it be really surprising if he gets killed midway through this season or at the end of the season and another villain emerges that they've...
You're totally right. It's set up for that. I guess...
It's not like anything hinges on one thing or another other than Mandalorian and other than Mando and the Yoda.
I do want to table our Maron rankings because I know we have a lot to say about the Patti Smith episode, but generally the thing about Mandalorian is the comparison I want to make is to a show I don't know if we've ever talked about, and it's the X-Files. And the reason I'm making the comparison is because the X-Files did a very delicate dance that was much commented on at the time and basically worked for them, which was almost like a spooky procedural for 18 episodes a year. I mean, that's how many they used to make. And then for 4 episodes every year, it would be extremely intense, serialized, overarching mythology insanity. And if you didn't know every single detail about, cigarette smoking man or the oil or all the bees, like then you're totally lost. And
there was a Reddit thread a while back that I'll try to dig up that essentially broke the show down because it's on Netflix, I believe still. If you wanted to watch just Monster of the Week, someone was like, here are all the Monsters of the Week episodes and what the monster is. And you could watch them in any order. And then they basically created here's how to watch the X-Files legacy show. And it's, 22 episodes or however long it is of across all the seasons.
And I am torn because at the time because this is coming off of Twin Peaks and ahead of Lost, but the kind of fan that I was all mythology. Like I ate that shit up and I loved it. So much so that I was annoyed by the episodes where Duchovny switches bodies with Michael McKean or whatever for a 2-parter. In retrospect, I mean, I think it was an incredibly difficult balancing act, but it worked not only because it gave them a lot of room to be different shows, from week to week and give a lot of different creative people an outlet to express themselves, but it also worked because the mythology didn't make any sense. I'm sorry, but it didn't make sense. Especially because they were kind of making it up as they went along because they didn't know how long the show was going to go. So there was no end game. And those problems now with shows are, shows aren't open-ended like that anymore. All of that to say, so far with Mandalorian, I respect the mission of the week hustle, and I love the fact that they are somehow appeasing the super fans without making me care too much about it. But I really did feel the show kick up a notch in the last 2 episodes of last year when he did the heist movie thing where he was like, let's go get Gina Carano. Let's make up with Carl Weathers. Let's get this droid back. By the way, shouts to Nick Nolte, his best performance in at least 25 years as the CGI Ugnaught.
He was pretty good in Affliction, but yeah.
Okay, so one of 2 best performances. That was kind of fun. And it had, for the first time, and maybe this was just like playing an old melody on my nerve endings, but unlike all the movies, except maybe portions of Rogue One, the recent movies, it did kind of make me feel like, oh, you could make a new story in this universe just by having some interesting, fun characters and you get them together with an objective. And it wasn't Jedi dependent. It wasn't Skywalker dependent. It was just its own thing. And I really enjoyed that. So to come back into this episode did the show have me when Baby Yoda was just like joyriding out the side of the speeder? Yeah, that the show knows what people want. That was a very satisfying moment. But the giant space worm vomiting yellow bile at Tusken Raiders for like 25 minutes, it's fine. It's fine.
I kind of wish there was a feeling that like everybody was watching this at the same time. I watched this on like Friday at like 10:30 a.m., which is sort of like a weird move.
Then you immediately got to work on your Oliphant costume.
That's right. And I will say that shout out to John Leguizamo, who got to play like a one-eyed Paul Mazursky in this episode. It just was like that was the most JJ moment of like, yeah, I'm not going to tell you, but now I will. You got to go to another place. Like that kind of that plot movement where it's like, first you have to find this box or this key to open this box of plot that I'm kind of tired of. Let's do Undoing, because the kid was skeptical. You were the kid. You were a little bit like, I don't know if I need this right now. I respect the hustle. I was like, I'm in. I want a mystery. This is the night of, but with Upper West Side shitlords. Let's do it. Second episode. And I want you to take it from here, man.
You guys know, I was pretty skeptical. I wasn't even going to watch this episode because we were going to be all Mando all the time. But as it turns out, Dave Wasserman doesn't tweet that often, no matter how many times I hit refresh on his feed. Because, side note, this is speaking of lords, this is the kind of edgelords Chris and I are. We discovered independently, neither of us follow any of the premier pollsters on Twitter. We just go to their Twitter feeds independently, as if that somehow makes us.
That's the more natural way to do all of this. If I could make a change, I would say no one should be able to follow anyone on Twitter. You should lose all your followers, and you should not be following anybody. And Twitter is just essentially like the bulletin board. And you're like, do I want to go see what Fennessy is saying, or Maggie Haberman, or Van, or Nate, or whoever, or Kaya? Can never know. And I think that you should have to go do that. That's what we're missing. It's like this ambient kind of like, well, this stuff is just lapping up at the shore. That's the problem.
So what you want is a return to blogs.
Basically.
You want websites. Yeah, that
it's funny you should say that about Wasserman, because like I looked at his Twitter feed. These are all pollsters, by the way, in case anybody's like, what the fuck are they talking about? I was looking at Wasserman's feed, and I was like, oh yeah, I've checked this like 3 times in the last 30 minutes, and he hasn't updated. And then for a second, the mouse hovered over likes and replies, or like tweets and replies. And I had this like horrifying vision of like, when you click on that, like all of Wasserman's tweets and replies would just him be like adding people, being like, same, yes, queen, go off, king, and like just normal, it's like Twitter stuff. And I was like, if I see that, I'm not going to be able to take his poll seriously.
You dropped something, king.
Yeah.
And but the king in this case is Monmouth University, who dropped their new Pennsylvania poll this morning. Okay, so I was very dubious, but I was finding it very hard to work on my actual work, so I fired it up. And I gotta say, I thought the second episode of The Undoing was exceptional. I thought it was a great episode of television. And partly, I think it's because the show snapped into focus. I mean, we can self-criticize, or we can just talk objectively about how difficult TV is right now to kind of engage with, because it's always starting over, and it's always starting something new and teaching you how to watch it. And it's very unclear what model shows are following in terms of how they're going to behave. Meaning, are they throwing you right into this world from jump? Or are they going to slow walk you into it? Is the first episode, we used to have things like premise pilots, but are they, in the case of The Undoing, a first episode showing you the way things were, so you have some sense of that, because the rest of the show is going to take you to a different place.
Right. You got to do 25 minutes of Hugh Grant being amazing before you take him away from the show.
And also, here's this beautiful, rich world, and are we supposed to be mourning it, or loving it, or jealous of it, or what's our feeling here? And I was sort of without a map. This show is not Big Little Lies. I mean that whether you liked it or you didn't like it. To your point, Chris, as you said, it's not just that it's a murder mystery, which makes me more interested in it. Generally, the show, at least for this episode, is so all in on a deeply, deeply unsettling POV feeling of total chaos and loss and uncertainty, which mirrors my own internal landscape this week, but does so in a way that I found really, really smart and really, really compelling. So if you watch the first episode and we're like, I don't care about these people on the Upper West Side, I think the show could take them or leave them in terms of what it's interested in emotionally, and probably what drew Nicole Kidman to it, because is more of what we see in the second episode. The show is just expert at pulling the trap doors on someone's life until they are free falling into an abyss, which is what happens to her character. And we talked about that moment at the end of the first episode where she can't reach her husband. This episode is that feeling for 45 minutes in a way that is unsettling, yes, this week, but it's also kind of delicious. Like it was so awful, and you could in a almost empathetic way. I was going to say none of these things have happened to me. I have attended a medical conference in Cleveland, but the rest of the things I think are unfamiliar to me. But I was definitely vibing with a certain kind of existential panic that can crop up when you're like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, that's the first thing I think of.
Sure.
And then maybe that's what's true. And I was really drawn in.
That you know where it's going. You know that Hugh Grant is going to be accused of the murder. You know that there is going to be some shoe to drop. I thought that the way that Kelly did
this is David E. Kelly who wrote the script.
Right. The way that he handled her going to the hospital, and the way the guy is like, yeah, hey. And he's like, I cannot talk to you. And you're like, well, what does I can't talk to you about this mean? There are terms. So obviously, like, it's just so well seated.
Flashback to the time I went to Sunset Gower to chat with you about an upcoming Game of Thrones special.
And Kaya pretended like she couldn't talk to you. Yeah. I actually haven't been doing this podcast for 3 months, and no, I thought that, while very hammy and like overblown, I thought that the interrogation scene was great. I thought that you can see Nicole Kidman. I'm not like the hugest Nicole Kidman person. Let me just say that I think some of her charm is sort of lost on me, and I'm not always like the hugest fan of the projects that she does, but I think she's very good in this. And I liked the fact that she was not just like, what? That there was a part of her character that was still guarded and trying to like protect herself from incriminating herself. And also was like a little bit still 1 to 10% on her husband's side, and was a little bit like, that can't possibly be the case. That's an interesting character. I'm not necessarily agreeing with her point of view. I'm just saying like, that's like an interesting character to watch on screen.
That's also why you cast Hugh Grant, because I am 100% still on his side. Even though he went for the, I would say, controversial double dip in one night with both his mistress and his wife.
Yeah.
He's a charming motherfucker. What can I say?
Yeah. And I thought that last scene is pretty great. My wife, like Phoebe, gasped when that happened. Yeah. I thought that the scene was really great. I do have to say, I have watched a lot of shows like this. And I think I may have figured this one out.
Yeah, you hit me with this, and I was angry at you, but I also think you're right. If you don't want to hear Chris's theory, which, by the way, I think can be proved because this was a book.
Second theory of the episode. Second theory of the pod.
Clap your hands over your ears. I don't think, unless you really want to hear our conversation about the Patti Smith episode of Marc Maron, sayonara, see you Thursday. Come on, hit us with a theory.
I think Henry did it. I think that they are setting this up for the kid to have done it. Now, that might be a red herring, but they have done like 3 or 4 times where Henry has like snuck up on Nicole Kidman and she's like, oh, you scared me. They've also done the few times that they've really cut from Nicole Kidman's POV is like lingering Henry kind of sneaking around shots. And he like comes down on the landing in the first episode and listens in. And he like shows up when she's in her room and just kind of is like, Mom, what's going on? He's like got a little bit of anger, about this whole situation. And also like comes out and sees his dad, and kind of like so Henry's lurking. And I'm just saying, if Hugh Grant is telling the truth, which, how could he not be? He's Hugh Grant. Someone's got to have done it. And it's either, it's like Donald Sutherland, Lily Rabe, or the kid. And I'm putting my money on the prepubescent child.
What about Annalee Ashford showing up outside the school? Love her.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
I would say longtime listeners of the pod know that this is going into the file marked Why Uncle Chris Can't Babysit. immediately assuming the child is homicidal in some way. But I think the other big honking red flag as opposed to red herring is that they went out of their way to cast an actor of considerable ability to be the kid. Mm-hmm. The kid is often where you save money in shows like this, or it doesn't get a lot of screen time. They cast this kid, Henry Jupe, I'm not sure how to say his name, but I guess made a big impression in Quiet Place and has a promising career. So sometimes you can kind of read the tea leaves about where they put their money in terms of casting.
Yeah, because they really skimped on the top two parts.
Well, right, but then you skimp elsewhere.
Right.
But that they clearly didn't. I think. Are
you saying that they skimped on Edgar Ramirez's partner part?
That guy could surprise us.
And they're like, Oliphant's not available. He's in Mandalorian.
Well, he's not a marshal. He can't play a police detective. It's outside of his range. I think I would be very disappointed if it ends up with a kid doing it. But I also think that a project like this, at its best, is probably going to disappoint on some level when all the cards are revealed. I think that what's more impressive to me is how they're managing the vibe, because it's very vibe dependent. And maybe it's a good place to close on, as we close this chapter on America, that the feeling that on some level you wouldn't be that surprised if everything you knew was wrong or was taken from you is extremely relevant at this moment, not just this week, but these last 4 years. And I think that has to have been in background noise for everyone involved in the project.
Nicole Kidman is the coastal elites.
Yeah.
And then the election is like her husband getting accused of murder.
Nicole Kidman is coastal elites.
Who's coming for you right now?
Oh, I could hear that. That's the coastal elites. Oh, no. Wait, I'm sorry. This appears to be New Jersey bridge workers for Trump. They heard my slander. I misrepresented myself in the Facebook group. No, I want to be clear that what you're saying is the Nicole Kidman in this analogy is Coastal Elites, the Paul Rudnick film that was on HBO earlier this summer. So she is roundly ignored by everyone who wishes she hadn't done it. Anyway, yeah, obviously this is all speaking from probably the same position of privilege, although considerably less privilege, but still privilege that David E. Kelly has. But there is something very of the moment, not just this week, that I think that is built into this that I'm really appreciating in a way that I didn't expect. And then when you have the scenes that are like the clockmaker's tools that you need for a story like this, whether it's Donald Sutherland in, get a lawyer, or Lily Rabe's character, an actual lawyer saying, "Oh, so fun story.
I represented your husband." Yeah,
you could do a lot worse than to have actors of that caliber delivering those scenes. So I'm really surprised that I remain in on the show.
Undoing heads. All right, Greenwald. We got another show this week. We'll see how the vibe is of that one. Everybody, go out there, vote if you haven't already. Let's do it, guys.
Let's change the narrative. Okay. The narrative lords here at the Watch Podcast would like some new content. That would be great. Go vote, Baranskis.
Have a good week.